Good evening. Welcome to Loyola University Chicago, our historic Water Tower campus, CORBOY Law Center. My name is Art Lorigio. I'm a professor of criminal justice and criminology and psychology and the dean of faculty in the College of Arts and Sciences at Loyola University Chicago, and a longtime friend and associate of Mr. MOGUL and the Academy. Actually, the Academy and Loyola go back at least 40 years in a partnership that has produced tremendous advantages for the university and for the Academy. Members of our faculty have served in offices in the Academy over the years, including the presidency and the Academy's archivist, the late Dr. Gad Bensinger. We're always happy to provide the Academy and Mr. MOGUL in particular with a venue for events. This evening we have a wonderful event that will introduce us to a specialty court for a population with tremendous needs, and a heroic judge who presides over the court, who I've seen on the bench, who does an expert job of combining law with great sympathy and sensitivity and behavioral health care services. So these are one of the courts that recognize, in the spirit of therapeutic jurisprudence, that the people who come before the bench can be best served not only by the application of the law, but by the application of science in the best selections for treatment and meeting their behavioral health care needs. Oh, I'm so pleased that I could be here to say hello to you and to introduce Mr. MOGUL, who is, you know who he is? He's the Wizard of Oz. He's the Wizard of Oz in the Illinois Academy. Everything that happens good, it's because of Ed and his unstinting devotion. So I'm pleased to give you the podium, Mr. MOGUL.
Thank you. I'll take it. That was a very gracious welcome by Associate Dean Art Lorigio, who has gone beyond just being a dean. Of course, he does interesting work himself in psychology, sociology, and criminology. He's also been a member of our academy, and he mentioned Gad Bensinger, who was his associate here in criminal justice. Gad was our archivist, who wrote the first 50 years of our academy archives, and they are in several libraries around the country. And we now have Shirley Melby, who is our archivist, and I'm glad, Shirley, that you're here. I wanted to say that more than just a dean, Art Lorigio is the man. He does things for Loyola that position this university in a very strategic way in the exciting things that are starting to happen at 26 in California. He's too modest to say that, but I'm telling you, you just heard from him. He wouldn't say that about himself. But I urge you to look into his work and learn from it. Now, we're going to have three speakers today. First is Dario Muller, who I'll introduce in a minute, who has a PowerPoint. Then we're going to hear from Judge Higgins, who administers the court, and then from YVETTE, who has matriculated through the court. And I think it'll be fairly interesting as criminal justice presentations go. And I'll try and move things along to make sure that our interest stays focused. I do want to say in an introductory way, what you're about to hear about is, I think, the beginning of a legal miracle. It's as old as the Bible itself, that there was a change in attitude when a very important figure said about the crowd that was about to stone a prostitute, let he who is without sin among you cast the first stone. In my experience as a trial lawyer, a criminal trial lawyer in Chicago, it has been a lot of stone casting, starting with women's court in the early 70s at 11th and State, where the judge would greet prostitutes, alleged prostitutes, on a Monday morning. There were never less than 180, often as many as 300 on a Monday. The judge would say, "Hello, Betty, nice to see you. See you again next week." It truly was a revolving door. It didn't do anybody any good. It was the mission of the vice police to remove soliciting women from the downtown hotels, especially in the South State Street area. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember that. It was not a pretty part of our criminal justice system. And it goes back to our history as a city. Chicago was wide open. We had the Levee District you've heard about in the late 1800s, where young men came to the city from the farms for economic opportunity. They were by themselves, and they would look for the company of young ladies, and there was a thriving brothel business, and so on. Two of our most prominent aldermen in the late 1800s were Hinky Dink McKenna and Bathhouse John Coughlin. And their names and titles tell you, although they were aldermen, they had their own bathhouse businesses and taverns. So the city kind of looked at this in a two-faced way. When it suited their needs, the city fathers would crack down, but they also winked at a certain amount of prostitution. And the people that are victims of that kind of hypocrisy get it from every direction, from the people who exploit them financially, not just their pimps, but their clients. Sometimes they have all kinds of problems. And I'm proud that in my lifetime, I've seen the court move from harassing and punishing and sending repeat prostitutes to the penitentiary to helping and trying to provide needed services. So it's in light of that that we're going to hear about this, I'd say, adventure, legal miracle that's happening at 26th in California. Now, our first speaker, Dario Muller, is a public policy consultant who focuses on policy solutions to address violence against women, poverty, homelessness, criminal justice reform, and particularly prostitution and sex trafficking. She has worked in the field of public policy with local nonprofits for the past 10 years. Her experience includes spearheading efforts to establish the Wings Project, helping to bring community-based resources and training opportunities to this treatment court. Daria currently leads legislative advocacy for the End Demand Illinois campaign, working to transform prostitution and human trafficking laws in Illinois. And she is an adjunct instructor at Dominican University's Graduate School of Social Work. Dario Muller.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so I think I'm kind of double mic'd here. So I have to admit I didn't quite time myself for this, so I might be kind of racing through. This was a presentation that I did back in the fall, and it took me about 45 minutes to get through it, so I tried to cut it down and try to just race through it. So just to kind of begin with, I'll say that I've been very involved with the Wings Court, and I think of it as a baby of mine, just as Judge Higgins does. And I'm very invested in it, and I care very much about it. I was involved from the beginning with Judge Biebel when we sat down and we were talking about prostitution and prostitution laws and record sealing initiatives and first offender probation for prostitution and a number of things. And together in that meeting, as we were sitting down and talking about the issues, and he was very interested in this issue of prostitution and how do we stop the revolving door that Mr. Mogul has talked about. So within these conversations, within a couple of meetings, this idea was hatched to start the Wings Court. And we were very lucky and blessed to get Judge Rosemary Higgins to preside over this court. But as we were talking about this idea, and before we even started bringing all the stakeholders together to discuss how we would implement this, what are all the things we need to think about before we get a court like this started, I started doing some research. And I was just interested to see if there were other prostitution courts, other treatment courts that were addressing individuals with prostitution offenses. And if there were, how did they do it? How did they get started? What was their model? And so slowly but surely I started finding prostitution courts around the country. But there was no clearinghouse of information. I could find plenty of information about the thousands of drug courts around the country and the mental health courts and even something about veterans courts, but there was nothing about prostitution courts, yet they were out there. So I began to talk to people and get a little word of mouth information about where other courts might exist. Eventually, with all these documents that I was creating, sort of little fact sheets about all the different court models, eventually I decided, well, I should really create a report out of this. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So first I'll go through where these prostitution courts are. And these are treatment courts, problem-solving courts, and the first set that I'll talk about are much more like the Wings Court in the sense that they have one judge who is hearing just these prostitution cases. And then there are another set that I'll talk about later that are more court-affiliated prostitution diversion projects. So to start with, I'll just kind of go through this a little bit. There's one in Columbus, Ohio called Catch Docket. One thing that I'll say is that all of these courts, none of them call themselves a prostitution court. So this is very purposeful. You don't want to have a branding, stigmatizing courtroom where all the women go and they end up calling it the prostitute court or something worse. So they all have more of a uplifting, empowering kind of name. So Catch Docket in Columbus, Ohio. Dallas, Texas has a number of projects. They have the Pride Court, which mostly sees misdemeanor prostitution cases, Star Court, which deals with more of the felony prostitution cases. And then they also have this court-affiliated diversion project called the Prostitution Diversion Initiative, which used to be at truck stops. Now it's just sort of at different areas, different hot spots around the city. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Gift Court is in the Twin Cities or Minneapolis. And New York has several different borough courts, Midtown Community Court, Brooklyn Criminal Court, Queens County Criminal Court, and Bronx Community Solutions. So they all kind of address prostitution a little bit different ways and see a little bit different populations. So some see a younger population, some see more of an immigrant population. They're each a little bit different, and they all work with different social service providers. There's another one, Pride Court in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is one of the older ones in the group. Project Dawn Court in Philadelphia. The Trauma-Informed Probation Court in Newcastle County in Delaware, and this is one of the newest ones, I think actually the newest one of the bunch. Wynn Court in Las Vegas, and the Wings Project, of course, here in Cook County. So that's about 12. Then the court-affiliated diversion projects, there's actually one that exists here in Cook County in Maywood at the Maybrook Court. However, it's not really running the way it was when it first started. There was one judge, now it's multiple judges. Those cases are mixed with, DUIs and other types of cases. And actually, they're seeing much fewer misdemeanor prostitution cases out of the court, and it was all misdemeanor prostitution there. Project Fresh Start in Wayne County, Detroit. Another diversion project in Portland, one in Phoenix, and another in Baltimore, Maryland. So no very small, rural areas. They're at least, medium-sized metro areas or larger cities. So these These specialty problem-solving courts all have a specific calendar day. Some, might be once a month, some might be once a week. But they're only hearing prostitution or prostitution-related cases. The court-affiliated diversion projects have multiple judges, as I mentioned. They have a mix of different kinds of cases and defendants. But they both rely on a collaborative cross-sectional team. So they're both working with social service providers. They're working with, of course, public defenders and state's attorneys. So a mix of different kinds of folks, and they're all really collaborating to try to address the multiple issues that the women in prostitution are dealing with. Other specialized treatment courts. So just to go through some of the findings. Now, this report is not very scientific, really, because I'm not a researcher by trade. I'm not in academia, and again, I started this for my own personal edification and to help with the process of developing the WINGS project. So, some of the information is a little bit, inconsistent, I'll say. But I'll go through some of the findings that I do have. So the oldest specialized treatment court is the Pride Court in Allegheny County, Pittsburgh, and the Queens County Criminal Court. So those both began in 2004. So we're not talking about a long history here. Now, I do know that there were other sort of prostitution courts, like the one that Mr. MOGUL talked about. I didn't include those here, partly because, as I mentioned in this next point, New York's Midtown Community Court is one that was around since 1993, but it really wasn't meant to rehabilitate. So they were directly dealing with these types of cases, but it was really more about quality of life for the neighborhood. It really wasn't about the women themselves and trying to offer them treatment and services. It was more about the neighborhood and the community residents who wanted a better quality of life, and the prostitution in the area was bringing their quality of life down. So it was more about community service and that kind of thing. The oldest diversion court project is the Prostitution Diversion Program in Phoenix. And that began in 1997 as a pilot and became permanent, a permanent regular project by 2001. Project Fresh Start in Detroit also began in 2004, and the rest all began within the last 5 years or so. So we really are doing kind of a new groundbreaking thing here. Most projects include women, men, and transgender individuals. So they're not necessarily just limiting themselves to working with women. There are a few that only serve women. And I think that obviously, when you're looking at the issue of prostitution, it is predominantly women involved in the sex trade, and predominantly women who are being arrested for trading sex. But there is a good number of transgender individuals, and we've seen them at the WINGS court as well. Most of the projects only deal with misdemeanor prostitution charges or prostitution-related charges or prostitution history. And honestly, that's because most of the other states do not have a felony upgrade for multiple offenses for prostitution. So they're just not seeing felony prostitution charges in these courts. So they're just dealing with the misdemeanors. Only 2 of the courts really just deal with felonies. And another thing that I found, of course, which was very interesting to me, because WINGS Court has no designated funding for any services or treatment, most of the other projects do have some level of funding, full or partial. So WINGS Court is one of the 2 that doesn't have any. Length of program or supervision really varies. I did see that the court-affiliated diversion projects had a shorter time period, generally speaking, from 90 days to 6 months, and then the treatment courts range from 1 to 2 years. The type of services offered are very common. Obviously, a big one is substance abuse treatment, mental health services. Some have some kind of transitional housing or some kind of supportive housing available. But there are really a range of services. I saw a lot that were really trying to make sure that those services were trauma-informed, and that trauma-informed services were really core and central to all the programming. Rates of success were really too difficult to compare. Part of that was because they're measuring success differently. So not all of them are seeing graduation even necessarily as a success. For instance, one project talked about success in terms of completing 2/3 of the treatment goals. Some really only had numbers related to recidivism, some had numbers related to who had stable housing or who had gotten employed or any number of things. So not all of them really had outcome information to share or were measuring it in the same way. And also, if you look at 90 days to 2 years, that's a really big difference, and you're going to have it's a really different way of measuring completion. If you can complete 90 days, it's really different from completing 2 years. But from those that did give me completion rates, I saw that they ranged from 25% to 60%. So we're not talking about really big numbers. We see that it's very, very difficult to leave a life of the sex trade. It's very difficult to deal with all the trauma, the mental health issues, the drug addiction issues, the lack of family support, the family reunification issues. There are just so many different issues to try to work through. It's very, very difficult to leave or just to complete a program. So there's a lot of relapse. Some other findings, I asked everyone what were their greatest challenges. And they said the biggest one, of course, was lack of resources, lack of available treatment, beds, lack of appropriate housing or other services, that there were wait lists, that there was inadequate manpower or turnover within the court staff or personnel. So that was really huge. I mean, that really kind of dominated any of the other challenges that were listed. But the next greatest challenge I thought was interesting, which was dealing with negative perceptions. So it was dealing with negative perceptions related to individuals involved in the sex trade. It was related to people who think that this type of treatment court is just too soft on crime, or questioning the value of the services and the treatment. So, and those negative perceptions can come from, the community, they may come from within the court, they might come from even social service providers. So those negative perceptions, I think, were really difficult for people to always be battling against when you're trying to provide treatment and services through a project like this. So I thought that in creating a report like this, I should have some recommendations. And these are my personal opinion. I'm not representing anyone else or even any other organization. These are my personal opinions of things that I think would be key to a prostitution court model. So all court, and I separate them in terms of court process, services, safety, and one other element that I can't remember, but I'll get to it. So all court personnel and social service providers involved in the court project should be trained on the dynamics of the sex trade. I think this is really important that everyone learns, the current research. What is the local research? What is the current research? What are the dynamics? And I think this also includes hearing from survivors of the sex trade, to hear from themselves. Not every story is different. But to hear, from survivors who can tell about personal experiences and how even going through the court and dealing with judges and public defenders and state's attorneys' assistants and social service providers, how that affected them, what could have been different. Collaboration is key. Everyone really stressed collaboration. You really can't do it without collaboration, without all these different stakeholders working together, being on the same team, having something like the Wings Steering Committee. So you really need to have, you can't just do this on your own. An advocate from a community-based agency specializing in prostitution, sex trafficking, sexual assault, and/or domestic violence should be an integral player in any court model. So this is something that I was really lucky to have the rape crisis centers who were willing to get on board with, and that Judge Higgins was willing to have them come on board and be part of the Wings project. And I think that it's important to have An entity that is outside of the court process, that isn't someone that they think can potentially offer a penalty or consequence by what they say, someone who can talk to them very confidentially and is trained in crisis intervention and dealing with issues of trauma. So that kind of, I think, gets to my next point. Prosecution, public defenders, and others engaged in screening should be trained in identifying human trafficking. So I think this is also really important. I think there are a lot of human trafficking cases that get missed as we go forward, and some of that is because women coming in may not necessarily self-identify as being a human trafficking victim. But that's all the more reason why all these folks need to understand what human trafficking is so that they can read between the lines, right? And they have the right questions. So that screening needs to take place so that we're not prosecuting those cases as criminal cases. Translation interpretation services should be readily available. Sanctions for noncompliance should be individualized, and they should be sensitive to the underlying issues, needs, and victimization. And I think that jail time should be last resort. And I did hear this from some of the other court models where they really try to have jail time as very, very last resort. They try to not do it at all. And rewards should be more common than sanctions. And rewards can be a variety of things. Rewards can be praise. Rewards can be clapping. Rewards can be, a flower, a rose. Rewards don't have to be, gift cards and those kind of things, although those can be rewards as well. But having certificates and things that allow a person to feel some kind of recognition, appreciation, that they've completed something, I think those things are important. Also, I think that the project should be pre-plea. And so this allows for case dismissal. It allows for the criminal record to not stay on their record. And, obviously that conviction on the record leads them to barriers with housing, employment, etc. It also allows you to avoid the dilemma of someone choosing to enter into the project because they think it's the only way to get services. So, pleading guilty because you think that's the only way to get services. Successful completion should result in the charge being vacated from the record. And, for some people, they may have a long record anyway, but even if it's just symbolic, I think it shows that they've completed something, they've done well, they've worked really hard, vacate the record. Eligibility, I think that any kind of prostitution offense should be eligible. So misdemeanor, felony, some states have all different kinds of offenses that kind of fit into prostitution, like loitering on a public way and different things like that. So they should all be eligible. All genders and gender non-conforming individuals should be eligible, even though you do need to have different kinds of services. And there are different kinds of needs. And those with violent offenses, severe mental illness, etc., should not automatically be screened out. I mean, we see that sometimes someone might have something from 10 years back that might be an aggravated robbery or something that is violent or something that would otherwise screen them out of the program, but that doesn't mean that that's, that might have been part of the sex trafficking, that might have been part of the prostitution sort of experience that they were involved with that kind of forced them into that situation. In any case, I just think that everyone needs the help. Available services should be trauma-informed, and this should be central to all programming. So, whatever kind of treatment and services they're getting, trauma-informed practices should be part of that always. And the services really should be specialized to those, to the needs of those impacted by sex trade. So in Chicago, we were really limited by the fact that there aren't a lot of organizations that are just specifically serving individuals in the sex trade. So sometimes you're limited by the resources you have. So we tried to do our best with that. The services should be community-based rather than within secure or corrections-based facilities. I think that should be the gold standard always, because one, you have to learn how to live in the community. So it's really easy to stay off drugs and stay clean when you're in a jail. You have to learn how to live in the community. The other thing is that being in that jail, in that secure facility, is also re-traumatizing for many. Available services should be culturally competent, reflective of participants' diversity, and one-stop shops are optimal. You know, oftentimes they have to go all over the place to see their probation officer here, and this social worker there, and to get outpatient treatment here, to go to their NA or AA group or PA group over there. So the more that they can get those services in one place, the better. And then this is, I won't go through all of this, but this is a list of some of the comprehensive community-based services that should be included at minimum. Again, it's hard with insufficient resources, but hey, we had none, and we were able to cobble these things together. And Judge Higgins and her staff are always finding more and more and more. Service plans should be individualized. The goal should always be achieving self-sufficiency so that they can move on and not have to be dependent on services that there are so few resources to provide in the first place. Survivor mentorship should be a big part of it because they need the peer support, and they need to hear from people who've been there, done that, and have had some success in their lives. And service providers should employ survivors of the sex trade to work with the women. We need to give back to them and give them the jobs and to validate their wealth of experience. Just really quick, safe private space to discuss issues. There may be a pimp, a trafficker, an abusive, intimate partner who's involved. So always having a safe private space to discuss safety planning. What is the home environment like? What are their intimate relationships? And then having court protocol in place to keep those who are not involved in the program out of the courtroom, especially for instances like this. And that's it. So that's my contact information, and this is where you can access the report. So hopefully I didn't go too much over time.
Well, for a non-academic, that was pretty exhaustive. I think she deserves our admiration for putting all that together. And I do want to recognize some people who are here. One of our past presidents of the Academy is Creasy Finney Hairston, who was she was a president, I believe, in 2003, I'm not sure, of the Academy. She is also presently the Dean of the Jane Addams College of Social Work at the University of Illinois. Creasy gave her regrets because she's out of town now, but she sent an able representative, Barbara Coates, who has in charge of projects for the Jane Addams College of Social Work. So that's Barbara Coates.
Thank you and greetings. And the Dean's been with us for over 20 years now at college.
That's wonderful. Creasy wrote her doctoral thesis about women in prison, I think. So she was a pioneer. Have you met Creasy Finney Hairston? I'm sorry she isn't here. We're very proud of her as a leader in the Academy. And we have other distinguished guests, but let's go on to our featured speaker, and let me introduce her. Judge Rosemary Grant Higgins is an associate judge, and she's been a judge in the Circuit Court of Cook County since 2003, 10 years. She currently presides over a full felony call, which requires her to hear a broad spectrum of felony cases, including murders and drug cases. In January 2001, she was assigned to hear the Wings Specialty Court Call, which addresses the needs of women charged with felony prostitution in Cook County. Before becoming a judge, Rosemary Higgins served as a director of Youth Services Bureau and assistant district manager in Chicago's Department of Human Services, providing an array of social services to citizens of Chicago. Thereafter, she was an assistant state's attorney in Cook County for 16 years, where she prosecuted bench and jury trials as a felony prosecutor and supervisor. Currently, Judge Higgins is the co-chair of the Criminal Justice Committee for the Women's Bar Association and chairperson for the Continuing Education Advisory Board for St. Xavier University. She has been appointed by the Illinois Supreme Court to the Capital Litigation Bar Screening Committee. Recently, she was selected by the Illinois Supreme Court Justice Ann Burke and Rita Garman to serve as a judicial liaison to the Illinois Juvenile Justice Leadership Council. She has taught trial advocacy at Loyola University School of Law and is currently an adjunct professor at the John Marshall Law School. I give you Judge Rosemary Grant Higgins.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Mogul. I thank the Academy, and especially I thank Professor Loriggio. He spent time today, the whole afternoon in fact, contributing to our steering committee. He has also volunteered to assist us with a research project so that we can analyze all the statistics we have on the more than 314 women who began in the project in January of 2011. Dario Muller is one of the founding members, let's say, of the Criminal Justice Court at 26 in California, known as Wings and Feathers. She did, along with members of the Coalition for the Homeless, Part Roundtable, and other social service providers, begin the discussion with Judge Biebel. He is the presiding judge at 26 in California and my supervising judge. I think that the discussions began as a consequence of a great number of women who are incarcerated, perhaps 140 or more. Daria, you would know better than I that initial number, because in 2010 I was presiding over a narcotics court with murders. And when you are presiding over that kind of a court, you don't engage with the additional charge of prostitution. I was asked to participate in the ongoing meetings, planning meetings, so to speak, in order to develop the protocol for the court. And my initial thoughts when asked to participate are, well, why am I? Because I can't accept the cases. I thought perhaps because I'd been assigned to domestic violence court for 4.5 years, just preceding my assignment to the felony court, that maybe that experience would be helpful, because most of the women, or perhaps all of the women, who are engaged in the trade have been a victim of that kind of experience at one time or another in their lives. During the course of that participation, when called upon to speak, I can't say that I was overly enthusiastic about my participation in the court. My feeling was, why are the women being upgraded? Because, like Mr. Mogul, I was assigned to the Prostitution Court at 11th and State in the mid-'80s. As a matter of fact, that was my first assignment in misdemeanor court after coming out of the appeals division for about a year. And we called that court Ho Court, which of course we would never, ever say again. But in those days, the women referred to themselves that way. And it was a euphemistic reference that was denigrating and really represented the fact that these women were stigmatized and marginalized. But we weren't sensitized to it. We hadn't been educated about it. We were there really to be kind to them. I don't ever recall anyone being unkind to them. Just as Mr. Mogul said, the judge said hello to them, knew most of them by name, as did the prosecutors and the public defenders. But they expected to see them again, because the way that was handled, as Mr. Mogul pointed out so correctly, was that it was a revolving door. And most often, they were getting arrested for 2 or 3 days at that time. They could get off the street where they were doing 20 or 30 tricks a day on the average, and they could get a break, and they could get a meal, and they could get away from any person who might have been controlling their lives at that time. We didn't see it as a negative process at all. Actually, probably we looked at it in a humorous way. We didn't dislike the ladies. It was just what we were assigned to do, and it was a revolving door. It was a never-ending process of the same women, the same problems over and over again. So when I was a felony prosecutor and assigned to the task of determining whether or not a case would be upgraded to a felony, and to be upgraded to a felony, you have a misdemeanor charge, and then on the second misdemeanor conviction, it can be by statute automatically upgraded. You could also be upgraded because you're within 1,000 feet of a school. We always rejected those charges, and no one ever pressured us or put us in a position where we felt we had to challenge, or we were being challenged for the fact that we were not following the statute automatic upgrade. So my first reaction was, well, why are we even here? Why is this happening? Well, something happened. I mean, anecdotally, I can give you my impressions about what happened, but for the most part, a change occurred. And as Dario Muller, do you mind if I take my jacket off because I have this on? As Dario Muller pointed out to you, the initial response to the court was a need because the women were incarcerated and they weren't being let out within a few days because now their case had been upgraded to a felony. And the potential sentence was 1 to 3 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, not 364 days, or in fact, probably 2 or 3 days time considered served. That is 2 or 3 days in jail, and then they would get credit for that fact, and that would ultimately be their sentence. When the Coalition for the Homeless and the other social service providers partnered with the court system to try to develop a protocol to help these women, they were recognizing that something had changed. And like Daria said, the misdemeanor courts were always where these cases landed. And so they had a judge who addressed that. Perhaps not in a formal way as Judge Biebel did, but he saw the need and he got out there and he looked for services. Footprints, pillars, community-based services where they have drop-in groups to try to give the women an opportunity to show up and look for an immediate service. Even if that immediate service was just a meal, a shower, medication, whatever the immediate street needs were. Well, as the felonies were being upgraded, perhaps by pressure from the community and the need for safe streets, as Daria pointed out earlier, perhaps by the fact that the movement of the drug monies were going from the narcotics courts, and I saw that shift because I had been in a narcotics courtroom before I got a full felony call. And when the money started shifting into human sexual trafficking, which is now what is referred to as a hot button topic, the police officers who were in the narcotics court started moving into these specialty areas. Well, if they are going to be assigned to these specialty areas, at least anecdotally you could say they need to make a felony arrest in order to justify their spot. Now this is just an impression on my part. I have no statistics to support this at all. But a shift occurred. Nevertheless, whether it was the community, whether it was the police department, whether it was a combination of both, a shift occurred and a need arose that was addressed by Daria and Judge Biebel. And like I say, I was kind of incorporated into this kicking and screaming. Not literally, but in my mind I was. Because I'd now been assigned a full felony court, and my perspective was that the felony prostitution charge is the lowest class felony. It's a class 4 felony, 1 to 3 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections, plus 1 year mandatory supervised release. I had more than 30 murders. I had very serious rape cases, attempt murder cases, and I felt like the women shouldn't have been prosecuted to this extent anyway. But my job, nevertheless, is to follow the law. And Judge Biebel, in his own inimitable wisdom, assigned me to the courtroom. And then, in his inimitable wisdom, they trained us. And Daria spearheaded that training process. She did an excellent job at it. And that was the beginning of our maturation and our appreciation for the circumstances that these women face. So my entire staff went through the training, as I did. That includes my public defenders, my state's attorneys, my probation officers, my task officers, the women's justice services in the Cook County Jail, and any social service provider who wanted to participate in the court or wanted to participate in the training. We actually had to cut it off at one point because we didn't have enough space for everybody to be seated. Well, we went through the training process, and it was a little more than a day, or a little more than a half a day, not quite a whole day. But it opened everyone's eyes. And even the most hardened of the criminal justice participants began to see the value in the work that we were about to embark on. That value and that appreciation for it was a slow-moving process, and it continued to grow as we had the women come into our courtroom. It started, as Daria pointed out, in January of 2011 with an order by Judge Biebel that every single felony prostitution case in the city of Chicago would be assigned to my courtroom, courtroom 206 at 2600 South California. When that process began, we anticipated, based on prior statistics, that we would have approximately 100 new cases in any year. We've had, since January of 2011, a total of 314 cases. It was initially begun as a pilot project for only 25 women. We reached that 25 actually in about March, but we didn't cut it off till September to say, well, we've now exceeded that number by many, by more than, we were at 50 or 60 at that point. What will we do now? Well, in the discussion, and that discussion actually occurred between Judge Biebel and I alone, he asked me whether or not he thought I could handle any more cases. My feeling was that our staff had become sensitized, and we had actually gone out. I have my staff attorney here, Susie Baccaro. She wasn't the staff attorney assigned at that time, but the staff attorney and I had gone out to every social service provider that we learned about through DARIA, through the other social service providers, and met with their agency representatives to learn about the programs and to develop more programs because we are not funded. So we rely on the criminal justice process to help us, but we look for less restrictive settings where we can find them, and we beg, borrow, and steal them where we can, literally. We begin with inpatient treatment, as Daria has pointed out. You know, when Daria talks about the fact that the preference is to restrict the amount of time in jail, that would be our preference. We, however, recognize that we need to have some inpatient treatment, particularly for many of the ladies. The ladies we have aren't like the misdemeanor participants. Many of them have hundreds of sheets of arrests, and the average number of felonies, I would venture to guess, is between 5 and 6. So they've got a very entrenched part of their psyche involved in the criminal justice system. And they have their own biases about the way the system treats them, most of which are legitimately based. They have, of course, their own tricks and manipulations to play. I think that of all the populations I've ever dealt with as a judge, they are the most manipulative. And unlearning that process is tricky. And we begin it with alcohol and drug treatment. The preference was to get an inpatient treatment setting for them because most of them have been through so many relapses over their time periods, and the statistics would indicate that over 90% of them have an alcohol or drug problem as a primary problem. They refer to it as co-occurring because they have that and others. But of this population, of all the criminal justice populations I've dealt with in more than 28 years, I can tell you that they have more problems because they have trauma informed to a greater extent by statistics, and those statistics were done by Jody Raphael from the Ducanto Family Institute at DePaul. They have more trauma than those individuals who have served at least 2 tours of active duty in the military in Iraq or Iran. And most of the statistics indicate they have 3 to 5. We think that's probably underreported and that they've suffered much more than that because they've suffered with rape in the course of the trade, beatings in the course of the trade, humiliation, degradation, domestic violence, mistreatment by the criminal justice system, mistreatment by those people in their own families who won't even permit them to engage. Many times with good reason, because they have learned to survive in a way that causes them to commit other crimes. Problems happen around them. And so the safety issues are legitimate for their families to be concerned about and legitimate for the community to be concerned about. But does that mean that they're throwaway? They aren't. We don't believe that they are, and we've seen differences if you commit yourself to it. Do we think that recidivism in and of itself is a goal? Obviously, as a judge, I don't want to see people come back through the justice system. But do I think that if that's the goal, therefore, if they're not reaching that goal, we have failed? I don't think that. Our recidivism rate is high, as Daria has pointed out, probably in the range of 50%. Some a little bit less, but I'd say 50% is a fair number. Many of them have picked up new prostitution cases. And regrettably, because I have so few resources, I often resort to the Sheriff's Women's Justice Program. And when I say regrettably, not because they're not doing a good job, actually they have really informed themselves and trained themselves to develop a protocol to help us with the trauma-informed counseling. The problem is that as a step down from the inpatient treatment services, I often will give them a band and then allow them to participate in the outpatient services through women's justice. because they are more likely to recidivate in that first 8 months based on my experience. And if they are on the band, they are more mindful of not recidivating. So when they go on the band, though, if they fail to show up for the treatment program, they are at risk of receiving a new charge, an escape charge. The escape charge by statute is a consecutive felony with 2 to 5 years added on to the 1 to 3. So we are inadvertently criminalizing them further by their participation in the court. I don't take that perspective on it when I am engaging them in the treatment process. And when I say I am the figurehead, I am the judge, but we try to engage in a team model for determining what to do with them. When there is a disagreement, I clearly make that determination. And there's no question that my philosophy and my perspective is going to drive it. But we often, and actually always, have recommitted them to another probation on the escape charge. Ultimately, I would like not to have that happen and work towards a change in that process. But my job is to follow the law. My job isn't to legislate change. Where I'm asked my opinion and it seems appropriate, I've done so. Nevertheless, they pick up new charges, prostitution and escape, and they're re-engaged in the process, but often with an additional treatment module added. They may have to go back into the Division 17 treatment program in the jail, which is trauma-informed as well and involves trauma of the Prostitution's Anonymous, support groups. It involves the alcohol and drug treatment, AA and NA, and also GED PACE, although we really hold that off until they've completed the alcohol and drug treatment. That's our primary focus. They're not clear-headed, they're not going to be capable of engaging. But it's all trauma-informed, and they have very good staff there. I am quite impressed with the program they've developed. I've been to see it many times, and YVETTE can tell you about all of the varying programs. She can give you an insider's view of the process. We would prefer to have inpatient treatment outside of the jail. We have no funding. Where we get funding, the women have medical cards. Now, with the Obamacare project, we're hopeful that we will be able to engage more and more of these women in inpatient treatment programs outside of the jail setting. And when we say beg, borrow, or steal, we've gone to the treatment programs and got them to agree to provide for us inpatient settings where they have another population who's perhaps not using those beds, and to utilize some exceptions in their grant that will permit us to get these women. And we have people in our court who are engaged in these services who will make a phone call. Do you have a bed today, right now? And we usually are able on any given Friday to come up with 2 or 3 beds. But that means that most of our people are in the jail or on a band or in what we call the 3rd tier down, the empowerment program. The empowerment program is an outpatient treatment program through the Women's Justice Services without the band. So it takes about a year to get through that initial stage, and I find that through the 2nd year I'm less likely to see recidivism, new charges, either escape or a new prostitution. I will often still see relapse, but that's not as much of a problem because they're permitted to come and acknowledge relapse to the court without suffering the original reincarceration that they might suffer if I were managing a normal court. They are allowed to acknowledge responsibility and re-engage because we reward that taking of responsibility by our participants. And at least that's our intention, to reward that. And that does encourage them to come forward. It doesn't always happen, but it mostly does happen. Our bond forfeiture warrant rates, are pretty high. We had, I think it was about 36% of our cases total had bond forfeited at one time or another. So at one time or another, they fell off the grid. They went AWOL, is the way some of them refer to it. They decided not to come back to court, or they just didn't show up for treatment. That failure to show up for treatment is really a problem when we're giving them one of the 2 or 3 beds we've got, and they don't show up for it, because we lose that bed. So that's where our difficulties come in. So we have to be really careful about picking our participants for those inpatient beds so that we don't lose those precious resources. And we, therefore, err on the side of caution in giving them the criminal justice-based band program or the Division 17, which isn't ideal for their treatment, but works better than just putting them out before they're ready to go out and risk picking up new cases, either possession of controlled substance cases, prostitution cases, or, God forbid, an escape charge, if that should happen, and it does happen. So we've got a model that was designed exactly like Daria had already pointed out, starting with the alcohol and drug treatment, inpatient, going to outpatient, perhaps intensive outpatient, then outpatient, all through that requiring AA and NA meetings at least one time a week, although they go more often than that when they are intensive or when they're with the Women's Justice Treatment Program. Then stepping down to outpatient. In the meantime, still always working on the Prostitution's Anonymous, the trauma-informed counseling. They get a certificate in trauma-informed counseling, but their individual counseling also engages in that. We have another issue that is a problem for us, and we've not solved it, and it's the most difficult problem for me, and that's the mental health cases. About 22% of our cases have been designated as mental health probation, and about 6% of those pled into our power probation program, because we refer to our wings and our feathers court as power probation. It started with a task case manager for our initial 25. But then task couldn't seem to handle our overflow, and we said, we're taking all of them. We are the only treatment court that doesn't screen for the likely winners. The mental health court, the women's mental health court, the veterans court, the youth court, the rap court, they screen for the winners. We take all of them. They screen the winners out of our court, and they take the winners, and we take the rest. And therefore, we have the ones with all of the problems, with the most serious endemic alcohol and drug issues, with the most serious trauma issues, with the more severe mental illnesses that require medication and are more difficult to matriculate through the program. And because the mental health court has rejected them, since they were not candidates for one reason or another. So we have a mental health component, and we try to engage them in the mental health probation, but they've not been trained through our wings court. However, we're starting to get the mental health probation officers to participate in our staffings. When they come into court, they initially come in and they have a public defender assigned to them. We've only had 2 or 3 who had private attorneys, and the ones with private attorneys very often have a second case where the male offender who would come into my courtroom, but then I recuse myself, send them back to the presiding judge for a reassignment. And that would be, theoretically, the person who is keeping the house of ill repute, the pimp, or in some way their trafficker, depending on the extent to which they're involved. Those women get private attorneys. You can understand why they get private attorneys, because theoretically they could then identify themselves as a victim of human sexual trafficking, avoid the prosecution altogether, but it would be expected that they would testify against the human trafficker. None of them to date have ever stepped forward to engage in that process, understandably so. So that benefit to them has not really been realized in practicality. Nevertheless, we get all of them. And as I've already stated, we have 314. So we started with our initial treatment court, and then we moved into feathers. So we said, we'll take everybody. It has become a voluminous problem. But even though we have no resources, we have become resourceful in many respects, due to the social service providers who are here. We have been fortunate to have agencies like our Rape Crisis Advocates and Coalition for the Homeless and Heartland Alliance and Pillars and Southwood Interventions and Haymarket and Gateway step up and help us when they weren't obligated to do so and had no beds, and give us staff to participate in our staffing who make that immediate phone call to say, can we get a bed for them? Can we take a mom's bed and give it to someone who's not a mom, at least until we get a mom who needs that bed? And they do it for us. And we've found that in the church-based settings as well. There are many recovery homes doing work and doing fine work. It's not as skilled as Gateway or Haymarket or Southwood Interventions, but it's still helpful. It gives us a recovery home bed so that they have a place to sleep that's not in the jail, and that will help us slowly transition them back into the community. It's a benefit. And so we involve ourselves with faith-based. Most of the AA and NA treatment programs are faith-based. And most of the ladies are faith-based in one way or another. Mostly Christian, some Muslim, but I would say for the most part Christian, and they don't mind. They're not obligated to participate in the faith-based aspect of the program, and we make them aware that that is what it is. And I've not had anybody say they didn't want to do that. Sometimes they don't like the structure because they're a little more structured than some of the alcohol and drug treatment programs. And many times they'll require no contact with the outside world while they're engaging in this process. Nevertheless, the real issue is that we are looking for resources. And we have been told that the empowerment program, which would have been our third step down, has been inundated with our referrals and can't take any more referrals right now. We found out today at our steering committee just before we came here. So we have fortunately been given by task another case manager who has a new grant called through Access, which is a healthcare system. So we're hoping that we can take advantage of that. But once she gets up to 30 cases, which will happen in less than 6 months, probably 4 months, we will be done with that and we'll have to look for another resource. I'm hoping by then they maybe will hire some new people and then something will open up for us. Ultimately, it's our intention to get the women out of the trade. Ultimately, it's our intention to get them educated. GED is a requirement, but we recognize that some of the women are not going to get their GED. Our average age is almost 40. It's 39.5 months or something like that. So if they don't have their GED, it's going to be more difficult. We have to get through literacy issues before we get to GED. And we still end with career counseling and employment and matriculating them back into society. That's our goal. We've graduated 6 ladies so far, and all of them graduated early. They completed the process before we expected them to complete the process. We have one of our graduates here right now. Ms. YVETTE BROOKS-GODLEY is present, and they asked me, or Mr. Mogul asked me to identify somebody, and I was so happy to identify YVETTE for many reasons. I believe that one other thing I wanted to say to you is that when we continue to accept new cases, and when we went beyond the first 25, actually we got to like 38, I think, one of the public defenders in our staffing said that the other ladies were getting a little disgruntled about the fact that they couldn't join WINGS, and how come they weren't good enough to be part of WINGS. It was a resource issue because we, as Daria said, cobble together the services. It's not as smooth and as easy as we expect. We don't always transition from one level to the other, but we always seem to find the piece that they need at the time, which really creates a more individualized program. So when we were faced with the question of what do we call the rest of the ladies, we were asked not to call them WINGS because we wanted to have a control group for research purposes. That's how we engaged Professor Lorigio. So we said, well, what will we call them? And this public defender said, well, we'll call them feathers. And I said, well, what does feathers mean? She said, well, we're going to give them their wings one feather at a time. So it made everybody smile, and we now dub them feathers. That seems to work for them, and they understand that it doesn't make them any different. They get treated just the same. The initial ladies got a little better case management because they had the benefit of very experienced task officers, and the power probation officers had to step up to the plate to learn good case management. They had to come out of their normal probation officer role and start looking at these ladies in a different way. Not a way to violate them, but a way to help them succeed. And look at it from, instead of what have you done wrong, to what can we do to help you make this right. And that's our goal. That's our plan, and that's our intention. We've got other things to help us in that support, and that's our steering committee. And Daria is one of our members, and we have other members as well. So I thank you all for your time and for your participation. I thank you, Mr. Mogul, for bringing a highlight to this issue and for allowing us the opportunity to express our interest in it.
In 40 years of criminal practice, I have never heard a judge speak that way. And some of you who are old-timers know what I'm talking about. We did have Judge Lou Garippo, Rosemary, you may remember, he had tasked treatment alternatives to street crime, but no one has had at their fingertips this kind of information. And it is a hopeful sign. I wonder whether we'll have time later for you to address what the attitude is of other judges towards this program. You mentioned yourself you were kind of drag kicking and screaming, I think you said. Yes. I wonder what other judges at 26th Street think of all this, and whether you can be frank in answering, I'm not sure. You have to be diplomatic, and you do work with these people, but I do, before our next and final speaker, who will tell you her story in a first-person way, want to recognize someone I think needs recognition. Malcolm Rich is the executive director of the Chicago Council of Lawyers. Some of you know every election that judges are up, evaluate the judges, and I think it's recognized in the legal community, at least, that their evaluations are the most meaningful. Malcolm is also in the directorship of the Chicago Appleseed Fund for Justice, which 2 years ago participated in a program I moderated at Kent with Chief Judge Evans, with 2 Cook County commissioners. There were some power people there, with Creasy Hairston from the Jane Addams School of Social Work, and with Daniel Coyne, a professor at Kent. And I can see in what I'm hearing now what was, I think, a beginning or an impetus that was started when they did a very exhaustive study of what really goes on at 26th in California. It's these people that are behind the scenes that don't seek recognition, to whom we owe a debt of gratitude. And I'd ask Malcolm Rich to please stand and be recognized. Malcolm, would you look? Okay, thank you. One other group I'd like to recognize, Susie Bucaro is the staff assistant for Judge Higgins. Susie, where did you go to school? Loyola University. I thought so. All right. And speaking of Loyola, let's not forget Dave Struckhoff, who was the president of the Academy. He unfortunately died a few years ago. He was a political science professor, but he was interested in criminology. And the last speech he gave for the Academy before he died was on chaos theory in criminology. I'm still trying to understand what he was talking about. It was brilliant. We also have a past president, Mickey Lombardo, whose book was reviewed favorably this Saturday, his book on organized crime. Mickey is a professor of criminology, criminal justice here at Loyola. He had to leave earlier, but he will be having a book signing next Tuesday through the library, Loyola Library Association. And he wrote a very good book, well reviewed, as I said, so I hope some of you will tell your friends who are interested in organized crime. It's organized crime with the mention of the involvement of the Chicago establishment. And one other person I'd like to recognize is a former president of the Academy of Criminology who came all the way down from Wisconsin. Every organization has its Yoda. It's wise, old, if you don't mind, man. And Cy Adler was a student of Ben Meeker, who was a legendary federal probation officer. Cy has been unstinting all of these years with his work with juvenile probation and federal probation. I'd like him, if you can. Cy, would you mind standing and please be recognized? Okay. All right. We have a lot of fun when we're able to all kind of waddle up to whatever group there is. There's a lot of wisdom in the Academy, and thank you, Cy, for coming. All right. Our final speaker, as you've heard, is YVETTE, and she has been a matriculant through this process. And it's always good to hear from someone who's been through it. So I would like to ask her to please come forward and for us to give her our full attention. Are you mic'd?
No, I'm good.
No, do you have the mic?
No, I can just stand close.
Okay, all right, fine. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yvette. My name is Yvette Brooks-GODLEY. But when I went through the court system, they dropped the G off my last name, and so I became Yvette Brooks-Oddly. But oddly enough to say, it became a blessing. It truly, truly did. Thank you, Mr. Mogul, for your introduction and inviting me here. First, I'd like to thank Judge Higgins for being the powerful, great, compassionate woman that she is, and for recommending me for this. I'll start with a little bit about me. I'm a 47-year-old mother of 7. I'm a grandmother of 5. I would like to let you know that addiction and prostitution has no respect of person. I'm a college-educated woman. I have a degree in culinary arts. I have also worked as a case manager for mentally and physically handicapped adults throughout the course of my life. I also need to let you know that I am an incest survivor. I have been diagnosed with mental illness. I have bipolar depression with PTSD. I am also a survivor of domestic violence. I have also lost custody of my children as a direct result of my addiction. As a direct result of my addiction, my career went from being a chef to prostitution. I started off using drugs at the age of 17. I started smoking cocaine. It used to be just to relax me. Then it became a primary focus of my daily life. When I became a parent, I was no longer able to take care of my children because my main focus was taking care of my habit. I forgot who I was. And long short of it, I forgot what my personal self-worth was in life. I accumulated numerous felony charges, started off with theft charges. I thought I could be a thief, going into the store stealing. Then I met some people that told me, you got something better you can do. You can prostitute. It's easy. You can do it, get away with it. So I tried it. Over the course of the years, I've been arrested so many times, I can't remember. I go to jail, as they stated, spend a weekend, a couple of hours in jail. I'm back on the streets doing it again. Until I got arrested, accumulated so many felonies, I was sent to the penitentiary. While in the penitentiary on a prostitution charge, it didn't treat the cause of why I was there. It only punished the symptom of why I was there. While I was there, I learned how to become a better prostitute. I say that because I learned new locations to go to. I learned new tricks to do. I learned new people to hang out with. I learned what particular hours on what particular days were vice days, days to stay in and don't come out, what time of day to do come out to make the most money. It never addressed my issues that led me to prostitution. There was a time I went into treatment. I accumulated 7 years of recovery, but I didn't address my root issues. I just stopped using. Then eventually I went back to using, which led me back to prostitution. In the year of 2011, I stopped using the drugs. In February the 1st of 2011 was my initial clean date. I didn't get high that day. The 31st of January was the last day I used. But I was still addicted to the lifestyle. I was addicted to the fact that I could go on the streets corners. I was addicted to the fact that I had these people that could call me on my phone. I could have sex with these men and make this money. For me, the prostitution became a symptom, a means of control for me, because I could control a lot of the situations that I got into, especially with men, because I had issues. No offense, gentlemen, but over the course of the things that happened to me created issues with me against men. It created issues where men took advantage of me growing up. So prostituting with men gave me the opportunity to take advantage of you, to control you in a sense. April the 8th, 2011, I was arrested and sent to Harrison and Kedzie Police Station, where I was sent to 26 in California. And they arraigned me and everything. Oh, you have a felony prostitution charge. I'm like, okay, I'm going back to the penitentiary. I went before the state's attorneys, and the state's attorney offered me off the back 18 months incarceration in IDOC. And I was like, oh my God, I can't do this again. So, unknowingly to me, while I'm sitting in 26 in California in the jail system, they put me on a unit where they had what was called the Wings Court, where you can become a part of this program, which directly dealt with issues of women in the sex trade. And I'm like, somebody told me that if I got involved in this court system, that I would not go to jail. So immediately, as Judge Higgins stated, we are some of the most cunning people. Ding, 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 a get out of jail free card. Initially, that's how I looked at it. So I went through the process of getting into this program. I went to the groups and everything. They assigned me to Judge Higgins' court. When I walked in there, the state's attorney said, we're offering her 18 months incarceration. Judge Higgins took one look at me and she said, nah, I don't think so. Based upon her record, that's not going to help her. She says, I'm going to give you some treatment. I'm going to let you go back and think about it, what I'm going to offer you, and you come back and tell me if you're willing to accept it. So I went back to my unit, and I sat and I talked to other people about it, and I talked to them, and they were like, girl, yeah, go ahead and take that. You can get out of jail. You don't have to go to jail. You can just go to treatment and you can get away. I'm like, okay. So I went back and I accepted her offer. And this is the first time I've admitted this. I admitted this to Judge Higgins before I came up here. But in the course of that, she sent me to Division 17. I'm still incarcerated, but I'm in a treatment program. I became involved with other people. I met some women there that were really serious about changing their lives, which kind of gave me a doorway to say, well, maybe there's something to this, for real, for real. August the 24th, 2011, I'll never forget that day. That's the day interventions came and picked me up. Well, my task agent came and picked me up to escort me to interventions for inpatient treatment. I was told to do 60 days there. In the process, the first 30 days, going through this treatment program, and the people that I say now, God, working through Judge Higgins, put in line in my life, allowed me to be able to dig deep inside me and find the real me, to deal with those issues that caused me to be there in the first place. I went through classes like cognitive thinking behavior. In these classes, I was taught to focus on the thoughts that I was having, why I was having them, and associate them with past events in my life, and to realize, is it because of something that's happening right now, or does this remind me of an event that happened in my past that triggered this feeling that I'm feeling right now? And through that, I became aware of who I am. I became aware that I no longer wanted to live my life. Because as a result of my addiction and my prostitution, I told you I've lost my children. I became totally homeless, destitute. I had no self-esteem. I went to sleeping in hallways, abandoned cars. I slept with men. I slept with one man in order to get an order of chicken wings because I was hungry. I had fallen that low from being a college-educated woman. After doing the 60 days there at interventions, I was sent to Haymarket in the Coke program to do another 90 days. But let me tell you, when Daria talked about rewarding us, every time I went to court, Judge Higgins looked at me and she smiled and she says, "I'm proud of you." See, sometimes all we need is somebody to believe in us when we don't believe in ourselves. Sometimes all we need is somebody to say, "You're doing good. Keep up the good work." And she did that for me. As a direct result of her in this program, I've went from being unemployed and homeless and destitute, and also through Heartland Alliance, I have my own apartment. I just bought brand new furniture for my apartment that I paid for myself without the help of a man or anyone else. I have regained custody of my 16-year-old child. He was my Christmas present. His dad, for Christmas, came with the guardianship papers and everything and signed him back over to me. My 19-year-old daughter is a part of my life now. She's teaching me French, you know. A lot of things that I missed out on in my life. I have a job now. I'm gainfully employed. And I have entrepreneurship with my own dessert business. How I became employed, I went to my employer. I'm a cook at Harold's Chicken, which is a major franchise. I went and I told him, "I need a job." And he was like, "Yeah, right, what can you do?" I said, "I'm a cook. I have a degree in culinary arts, and I can do this." He's like, "Yeah, right." I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll make you a deal. I'll work for you for free for 1 day. If you like my work, hire me. If you don't like what I do, I'll never come in here and bug you about a job ever again." He says, "Okay, you got a deal." He put me in play on a Friday afternoon, which is the busiest day of the week. I worked from 10 o'clock that morning till 10 o'clock that night. And when I finished, I looked at him and he looked at me. He says, "You got a job. Be at work tomorrow." I went from being a part-time cook making $8.25 an hour to being a full-time supervisor with 8 employees up under me in less than a year, making $13.50 an hour. And it's all because somebody believed in me and gave me a chance. This program, the WINGS program, treats the cause and it doesn't punish the symptoms. Prostitution, jail, drug addiction are all symptoms of a cause that happened in our lives where somebody forgot about us, where somebody mistreated us, where somebody told us that we were no good and we internalized it. Today, I know that I'm a valuable, productive, wonderful, vibrant woman. And it's because somebody gave me a chance, and I didn't give myself a chance. And them giving me a chance, I gave my chance a chance. And it opened up doors to me. And I just ask that women coming behind me be afforded the same opportunity to realize how vibrant they are, to realize that they truly are worth something. And no one can ever take that away from you ever again. Thank you.
Look at that, a standing ovation. Well, usually people cry at the end of our productions because they're so boring, but it's different now. That was very wonderful cross-section of the different aspects of this pilot project. I think I can say it's still a pilot project. I hope it becomes something more. You are now instructed as to what is going on and you can tell others. This will also be streamed on YouTube by our very able videographer. He's direct from Hollywood. His name is David Grier. He has his own production company. He does wonderful work. Congratulations on having attended, and you'll see this up on YouTube. Good night.